Hey guys, if you talk about morality long enough, you're eventually going to come across something called the naturalistic fallacy. So in this video, I'd like to explain what in the world the naturalistic fallacy is, as well as why this character named G.E. Moore comes up with the fallacy in the first place. Now, if you want to hear it straight out of the horse's mouth, hear it from G.E. Moore, what the naturalistic fallacy is, I've actually quoted the relevant portions of his book down below in the more info section. So feel free to pause this video and check that out if that interests you. The problem is that a lot of people find Moore's explanation to be a bit complicated. So hopefully we can explain it in a bit easier way to understand. I guess we'll see. The first thing that you need to know is that Moore is something called an ethical non-naturalist.
This means that he thinks morality cannot be defined.
In his words, he says morality can't be defined by any natural properties. So I think the best way to figure out what this means is just to look at some philosophers who do try to define morality in terms of natural properties. There's no shortage of them.
Some philosophers think that morality is identical to whatever brings pleasure. Others think that morality is identical to whatever God commands, whatever maximizes well-being, whatever meets our desires, and some even argue that what is good is identical to whatever is natural. Moore thinks that all of these attempts at defining morality, and in fact any attempt at defining morality, will be fallacious.
This argument, I think, makes a whole lot more sense if we just look at some examples. So let's talk about breasts. You know, like female breasts. Breasts, like these, are composed of fat cells. It's entirely accurate to look at a pair of breasts and say that these are actually just lumps of fat cells. But it's not possible to do that backwards, so not all fat cells can be identified as breasts. After all, is this a breast? In the same way that fat cells cannot be defined by breasts, morality cannot be defined by any natural properties. Let's look at one more example to make sense of this.
Alright, this is a baseball. This baseball is made of cowhide. It is entirely possible to define this baseball by the cowhide that composes it. But I can't look at cowhide and say this is a baseball.
Okay, that would be really backwards thinking. Right? We can identify a baseball by the cowhide that composes it, but cowhide is not identified or defined by a baseball. Again, that's just really backwards.
Yeah, even if every single baseball was made of cowhide, I cannot look at a piece of cowhide and call it a baseball.
Exactly. So similarly, Moore thinks that we do this sort of backwards thinking all the time when we talk about morality. Pleasure, God's commands, well-being, whatever's natural, and in fact anything else I can think of, might actually be good. The problem is that he doesn't think we can identify or define goodness by appealing to those properties. Take for example pleasure. Pleasure can be identified as good, but goodness is not defined or identified by pleasure. Even if every single act of pleasure always happened to be good, it would still not be accurate to claim that goodness is identical to pleasure.
Similarly, if all breasts are composed of fat, which they are, we cannot look at all fat cells and identify or define them as breast. If Moore is right, then identifying pleasure, God's commands, well-being, whatever is natural, or any other properties as the definition of goodness will be as fallacious as looking at these fat cells and calling them a breast.
Alright, so in the next video, we're going to be taking a much more detailed look at the naturalistic fallacy. In fact, we'll be turning a critical eye on both the naturalistic fallacy and on some of G.E. Moore's other conclusions. So stay tuned for that video if you want to see more breasts. more information on the naturalistic fallacy.
And as always, test everything, hold on to the good.